Hey crafty people, it's Tasha here, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm showing a video that I originally shared over on the Heffy Doodle page. Today we're going to be doing some trapped pattern emboss resisting. Try saying that 3 times fast. It's such an awesome technique and it's honestly so easy. Let's go through the products that I'm using. Scribble On My Heart stencil, the Spring Breeze pattern papers, freshly cut grass dies, Honey Bunny Boo stamp and die set, You're So Sweet jumbo sentiment, and the Imperial mini scalloped rectangles. I've chosen one of the papers from Spring Breeze. I've got the Scribble On My Heart stencil held in place on there. I'm going to cover the whole panel with Wow embossing ink using a foam applicator. Now, I usually favour the domed ones, but the flat definitely work better for this technique. Once I've got ink loaded on my applicator, I'm kind of pressing and slightly turning to get the ink onto my paper without disturbing any of that stencil. You don't want to be moving the applicator too much, or you're going to get ink seeping under the stencil and you're not going to get as good a result. Once you've covered the whole panel, gently peel back the stencil and you can just about see the pattern when you tip it in the light. Now we cover that all with clear gloss embossing powder. So this is where we get the trapped pattern portion. Because once heated, that embossing will create a seal over the pattern that's underneath. It's going to protect it when we add any other wet mediums over the top. The cork mat that I've got underneath is helping the heat go through the paper evenly, so it speeds up the embossing process, but also will reduce the risk of this paper warping. It doesn't look like much has changed at this point, but if you tip it in the light, you can see the glossy areas where the heat embossing is. But now comes the magic. I'm adding ink over the whole panel. You start to see that beautiful stencil design. Ink goes into the non-embossed sections, but the embossing resists it. I'm using my favourite domed foam blenders again and covering the entire panel with crushed violet ink. I'm building up the colour gently because this is only paper, not cardstock, so you do want to be a little bit gentle with it. Once that ink is across the whole panel, I'm going to create a sort of ombre effect by adding the darker and more vibrant glam ink to the bottom half. That embossing resists the ink, but we do need to wipe it off there once we've finished. I'll start with a dry cloth and just buff the majority of the ink off. Then, to get any stubborn remnants of ink, I add a tiny amount of water and gently wipe over the embossing. You want the cloth to be barely just damp, certainly not wet, and you need to gently swipe so that you don't get that damp cloth onto the inked paper bits. I'm cutting it down with the second largest die from the Imperial mini scallop dies, and that gives us a nice white border on an A2 card panel. Now let's stamp out the images from Honey Bunny Boo onto some Heffy alcohol marker friendly cardstock. I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black because A, I love how crisp it is, and B, it dries slower, so I'm using that to emboss my images with that same clear gloss powder. It gives such a really nice finish when it's used with VersaFine. I much prefer this method over embossing with a black powder. I'm just doing some quick and easy colouring with my Copic markers. I want my bunnies to be yellow, and I'm starting with my lightest shade, just colouring over the entire image with that one first. Then I'll skip to my darkest shade, adding a single line in any of the places that I'd expect there to be a shadow. Really don't overthink this step too much. I'm not colouring as though there's a specific light source. I'm just literally adding shadow wherever I think it'd look good. Then I go to the mid shade and blend those shadows out a little, putting colour against any of my shadows and extending them out a little bit further. Before I finish with that lightest shade again, drawing out the shadows further, but I do leave some of that bunny without any of the second layer, so that area then becomes my highlight. It'll look a little bit extreme right away, but it does settle and soften as it dries. The Heffy alcohol-friendly cardstock is so good for blending on. If you've never tried it, I highly recommend it, especially if you're not very confident with your alcohol marker colouring. This paper kind of does half of the work for you. I coloured the rest of my images in the same way, but I did only use 2 shades for all of those smaller sections. Then I almost forgot to give my bunnies rosy cheeks, and I also added a little bit of soft grey to their tails. Using the coordinating dies and my Heffy mini die cutting machine to cut them out. And I just have to show you, this die cuts his little paw so you can tuck something in there to look like he's holding it. It's just too adorable. I'm stamping out some tiny butterflies that are in the same set, but when they're as small as this, I find it's much easier to die cut first and then stamp them in my MISTI. So I line up each stamp in the negative piece and I pick them up on the MISTI door. Then I'm using some Memo Tape underneath to hold the die cuts in place whilst I stamp on them. To give a little extra detail to my scene, I'm colouring a little tuft of grass that I've die cut with the freshly cut grass set. Just simple colouring with a couple of different shades of green. Again, I'm holding it in place on some Memo Tape. It comes in so handy. Now we move on to the sentiment. I wanted to show that the actual sentiment die for this fits in your mini machine, which I have to say I love. So I'm cutting it from white cardstock and I'm going to colour it myself to perfectly match the colours in my background. Catherine Pooler inks are amazing for direct paper techniques, and it makes it so easy to custom colour your cardstock to match other inky details. So I'm going for an ombre again. I've used the crushed violet on the upper half and then glam for the lower section. To help blend them a little bit, I'm swiping my glam ink pad up into the crushed violet a little. I'm loving how that looks, and it's so quick and easy too. I've got 3 more white die cuts stacked up, and I'm adhering those behind my newly purple one with a slight offset. Then I'm putting all of those onto an offset gold mirror layer. This really helps the sentiment stand out, and it just adds a fun little metallic touch. I'm gluing that stacked sentiment onto our beautiful background before popping that whole piece up on foam adhesive onto an A2 panel. I'm creating 2 little mini scenes around the sentiment now with my coloured images. I'm using a mixture of foam and liquid adhesive and finishing with those cutesy butterflies flying around both mini scenes. So that's how I finished the card, with that trapped pattern emboss resist panel. Such a fun technique, and you can really use it to make absolutely anything. Honestly, the only limit is your imagination. I hope you liked the video. Don't forget to drop us a comment below. I'd really love to know if you've ever tried this technique before. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiration. Have a lovely, happy, safe and wonderful week. Stay crafty. Bye.